Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we have taken up daily edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 17th of December 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion.
In our weekly series of mains question assignment from DNS, the question for today's assignment is highlight various issues with the appointment and removal of Governor of States. Also mention recommendations by Sarkaria and Punchi Commission in this regard. The question needs to be answered in 250 words. The link to the question can be found in the description of today's DNS. You can type the answer in the comment box or click the image and send your answer to us. All those who will send their answers by Saturday will get the evaluation and feedback from RAU'S teachers. Alternatively, you can log in to the ELEARN platform and go to the mains question assignment.
Dear students, RAU'S Prelims Test Series 2021 is a complete testing and revision course for the upcoming prelims examination. The program will help you prepare for UPSC prelims through a step-up approach. It is a meticulously designed study plan to organize your preparation and keep you on track towards covering the prelims GS and CSAT syllabus extensively from NCERT to the advanced level. The goal of our Prelims Test Series 2021 program is to exhaustively cover all standard sources of study material, including NCERT, with a study plan to test you at par with UPSC level of questions, thereby improving your chances of clearing the prelims examination. To give multiple revision of the entire syllabus from the perspective of civil service prelims pattern. The test series program will also give you the final revision of all topics and themes before the examination through QIP videos and prelims compass notes. The QIP videos or Quality Improvement Program videos are for speedy revision of all important topics for the upcoming prelims examination. QIP videos are kind of crash course for the prelims examination. And prelims compass are 8 subject-wise prelims compilation of all static and current affair topics important for the upcoming prelims. RAU'S Prelims Test Series 2021 will include topics test, testing the concept of candidate. It will include thematic test on both the concept and the current affair of that particular theme. It will also include current affair tests covering the monthly current affairs. And there will be full-length test before the final exam to simulate you for the D-Day. There is a link in the description of this video. You can click on the link for registration and to also check out the demo QIP videos.
Okay, so first news which we have taken today appears on page number 7. The many challenges of WTO. So recently a good news has arrived because for the first time in its 25-year history, the World Trade Organization will be led by a woman. And the reason for that is that both of the contending candidates for the Director General post are women. One is from Nigeria and another one is from South Korea respectively. So obviously a new Director General is about to arrive on arena, and we know that for any organization, the first and the foremost priority should be dealing with the issues plaguing that organization. And in this regard, the author has published the article highlighting few of the important challenges being faced by the WTO. Now, why is it important for civil services examination? Now, if you have seen the syllabus of GS paper 2, you must have seen an important line. Important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure, mandate. And so in this regard, not just for the prelims examination, obviously this is important for that, but from the perspective of mains examination, there are few things which are very important. And so in this regard, we will start by first understanding why is there a need for such an international organization. Why in the backdrop of World War II, a need was felt for that GATT was created. And then finally WTO took it from there. So we'll understand the basics of WTO, its advantages, and then finally we will look into the challenges currently being faced by WTO. Now starting with the basics, because most of our viewers are quite new and for them it is very important to understand how and why it was created. So before WTO there existed a GATT or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It more or less functioned on the same lines, which was created in 1948 to regulate world trade. And it was created as a means to boost economic recovery after Second World War by reducing and eliminating trade tariffs, quotas and subsidies. So during the Great Depression, a breakdown of international relations and an increase in trade regulation made poor economic condition even worse, and it contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. And just as the war finished, allies believed that a multilateral framework for the world trade would loosen the protectionist policies that defined 1930s. Now what are the protectionist policies and what are these tariffs and quotas and subsidies? So these are a way to carry out protectionism, which is a practice of following protectionist state policy, which allows for the government of a country to promote its own domestic producers, service providers, and thereby boost their domestic production of goods and services. For example, let's say if there is a government contract, and if Government of India mandates that only Indian companies can bid for that contract, that is a kind of protectionism. Similarly, let's say that Government of India puts a limit on how much cars can be imported, let's say 100 per year, that is a quota. Similarly, Government of India can impose, let's say 100% import duty on a lot of products, and that is tariff. Or in other ways, the Government of India can provide domestic producer of cars 50% rebate in, let's say, iron and steel. And so that is a subsidy. And so all these kinds of measures are called protectionist policies. So the taxes or duties imposed on imports are known as tariffs, restriction on the volume of import are known as quotas, and negative taxes or tax credits are known as subsidies. So these are the three main ways of providing protection. And let us understand them by an image which you can see on your screen. So these are tariffs. Then government provides subsidies, which allows producers to lower the price of local goods and services because they are getting benefits from the government. Then you impose quotas. And then no matter how low a fee sets the price through subsidies, it cannot ship more goods because there is a limit on how much you can import. And even if that good is very cheap, you cannot import more than that. And then finally, you tweak with the currency. Deliberate attempt by a country to lower its currency value, which would make its exports cheaper and more competitive. So in the build-up of World War II, most developed countries across the world increasingly resorted to these four methods, and because of which the global trade was suffering, because protectionism has its own fair share of disadvantages. Of course, it offers more growth opportunity, lower imports, more jobs and higher GDP for the local population or for the residents of the country. But in the longer term, it is not good for any economy. Why? Because first and foremost, it leads to stagnation of technological advancement. As domestic producers don't need to worry about foreign competition, they have no incentive to innovate or spend resources on R&D of new products. Similarly, there is very limited choice for consumers. If you ask your parents about the choices they had about electronics goods or even cars, they would tell you that they were not available because consumers have access to fewer goods in a market as a result of limitations on how much foreign goods can be imported because of protectionist policies. There is increase in prices due to lack of competition. Consumers will need to pay more without seeing any significant improvement in the product. And since there are very less number of choices, consumer has to choose what is available. And finally, it leads to economic isolation. Because there are high tariffs, there are quotas, and there are subsidies given to local markets and local producers, that country or that economy becomes to grow increasingly distant from other economies, and so the exchange of ideas is minimum, and which leads to not just economic but also political and cultural isolation. Just try to think of North Korea when you talk about protectionism. It's just not economically isolated but also culturally and politically. And so that is why a need was felt to create an organization which would counter protectionism would liberalize trade by reducing tariffs and removing quotas among member countries. This will not just counter protectionism but increase in global trade, which would then boost the war-ravaged economy of World War II scenario. And so in this context, GATT was thought of. Ultimately, it was taken over by WTO later on, but this is the context in which WTO works. So far, we have understood why it is important to have a global institution working towards a global trade or a rule-based trading system. So some important aspects of WTO is that it was established in 1995, or rather it took over or changed its form from GATT to WTO, and it is a successor of that, and it deals just not with goods, which was the main emphasis of GATT, but it deals with services, intellectual property, dispute settlement, as well as trade monitoring. An important aspect is that it is not a specialized agency of United Nations. Although it has an arrangement with the United Nations through which it maintains strong relation with United Nations. So this is a very important information. And so WTO functions for smooth, free and predictable global trade, or for the creation of free trade, which is a policy that means governments do not charge people to import or bring in goods from other countries or make exporter pay taxes to send their goods abroad. Because you need to understand that when companies invest in other countries, they want the trading rules to not change suddenly in their disadvantage. And for that, they need protection. And so that framework is provided by WTO. And so it is important for us to understand and appreciate the advantages which are derived from WTO. So first and foremost is that it talks about a gradual reduction of tariffs. As you can clearly see the example of United States on your screen. On your y-axis we have tariffs as a percentage of imports, and on x-axis you have years. And if you start looking from 1940, you can clearly see a gradual reduction in the import duties imposed by United States. And similar is the case with other countries as well. And so it talks about gradual reduction of tariffs and through which it wants to promote free trade. Then it acts as a legal framework, not just for negotiation of countries or among them, but also for other kinds of trade barriers as well. Then it enables trade without any discrimination, and it is not like that WTO is just a body vouching for free trade or completely free trade, which means no tariffs, no barriers, no quotas, nothing. It allows for tariffs and trade restrictions under certain conditions. For example, if a country A feels that a country B is exporting very cheap raw material which is artificially deflated, then the country A can impose duties without violating WTO rules. Similarly, there are clauses such as national security which a country can utilize to impose significant barriers to trade for a specific country. And then finally, all these rules are to protect fair competition because there are rules which member countries have to abide by. Whether it is about subsidies or contracts or import or export, once you become a member of WTO, your national rules have to align by the general framework. And so that is how the disadvantages of protectionism are countered. It leads to lower prices for consumers because then imports become cheaper. It promotes fair trade because then foreign companies can function in any of the countries which are member and can expect a fair treatment from the government. Then it leads to specialization because when all companies are treated equally, then the companies can produce a product anywhere across the world. And that location is mainly decided by the factor of manufacturing cost and not other policies like quotas and tariffs and other barriers. And finally, it leads to the development of economies of scale. Because by encouraging free trade, firms can specialize and produce higher quantity. This enables even more economies of scale, which is important for industries, especially in the current context. And the success of WTO is demonstrated by the raw data. WTO has over 160 members representing 98% of world trade. There has been an increase in the trade dispute which have been brought to WTO, showing that WTO indeed has become a forum to help resolve these disputes. Also, WTO regulations have helped avoid a major trade war. And finally, let's see the data. So on your screen, this graph shows world exports as a percentage of GDP. So on the y-axis, you have exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP, and on x-axis, you have timeline, and you can clearly see an increasing trend throughout. So this clearly shows increasing global trade in last 50 years since the time a global rule-based order was established in global trade. Despite all its advantages, there are some issues, and they are significant ones. There are a lot of areas where WTO has been severely criticized. On one hand, it is true that it has led to counter-protectionism, but on the other hand, it is also true that it has given rise to inequalities, not just in terms of wealth, but also in terms of industrial and other kinds of development. Let us understand how. So first and foremost criticism of WTO is that it is unfavorable to developing nations because it is derived from GATT, which was established in the context of World War II, and all the victors and the global north came together to frame a rule which was very beneficial to them. For example, let's take the case of tariff protection. This is the way which was resorted to by developed countries during the time of Industrial Revolution. They utilized heavy import duties to stop the import of goods from foreign countries. US did it to exclude Germany, Germany did it to exclude Britain, and each one of them did for each other. They utilized these tariff and quotas to grow their economy. And now once they are developed, they have access to technology, they have access to capital, and now they want developing countries to significantly reduce their tariff barriers. They want India to significantly reduce and continuously lower their import duties. And so we know that countries like India and other countries do not have industrial base. And at that point of time, if the import duty is significantly reduced, it leads to the import of cheaper products from foreign countries, and then which further deters the industrial growth. And the second reason why it is unfavorable to developing nations is the categorization of most favored nation by WTO. So under WTO agreement, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. So for example, they cannot grant someone a special favor such as a lower custom duty or rate, and if you do it for one, you will have to do it for others as well. So what does that mean? That means that if India is providing special treatment to a third country A, it will have to provide the same treatment to company from USA, a company from China. And that is a problem because companies from USA and China are pretty strong, right? Negotiating at WTO or any of its meetings require a very high level of specialized and technical knowledge of not just the law, but also about nuances of trade and economy, which developing countries generally do not have. And since they do not have that kind of human resource which can negotiate on their behalf, more often than not, the agreements, especially for African countries, are designed against them. And of course, when it is unfavorable to developing countries, in more aspects, it is favorable to developing nations. Because the way negotiations have been designed or the way agreements work, they enable various kinds of protection. And these protections are applicable only for developed countries. Let's take the agreement on agriculture, which is the framework which governs the farm subsidies of WTO, which is the agreement of WTO which governs the farm subsidies. It has categorized the farm subsidies into trade distorting domestic subsidies and non-trade distorting subsidies. So all those subsidies which are trade distorting shall have to be eliminated, whereas all which are not trade distorting can go on. So all trade distorting subsidies are categorized under amber box, whereas non-trade distorting subsidies are categorized under blue and green boxes. And so under WTO, these are allowed. An interesting fact is that most developed nations provide their farmers with the kinds of subsidies which are categorized under this box, whereas the way India or the way other developing nations provide subsidies to their farmers have been categorized under trade distorting, and it is a pressure on them to put an end or at least reduce these subsidies, which of course is in favor of developed nations. Then recently, there has been a push for change in definition of developing country under the principle of special and differential treatment. So which talks about upgrading certain developing countries from the status of developing. And this is going to deeply impact not just India, but many other countries like China, Egypt, Turkey, as well as South Africa. And the reason behind this is that there is an assumption that these countries have benefited immensely from WTO rules since its formation in 1995. And there is also a belief that these countries have progressed enough that they should not be getting benefits of a developing country. And so that is also going to act in favor of developed nations. Then a very important and a good thing about WTO is that all decisions are made on consensus. There is no concept of voting, and unless and until all the members agree to a particular agreement, that shall not come into force. That is a good thing, but that itself has become the biggest roadblock in the progress of WTO. Since the members of WTO are clearly divided between developed, or you can say global north versus global south, there has been a lack of development on any of the major agreements in last 20 years. And there is a fragmentation among countries. So for example, developed countries want to push their agenda with respect to rules on e-commerce, investment, intellectual property rights. But exactly on these agenda, developing countries are quite reluctant. Similarly, developing countries want to push for reform of agreement on agriculture, which developed countries are not interested because they already are having a lot of benefits from that. Then there are other issues as well. For example, agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, or acronymed as TRIPS, which is an international legal agreement between all the member nations of WTO with respect to rules regarding protection of intellectual property rights. For example, protection of patents, copyrights, logos and various other such creations for companies from one country into another. It establishes minimum standards for regulation by national governments of different forms of IP. And it has been mainly criticized by developing countries because of its discriminatory nature. Because it is discriminatory in nature. Why is it discriminatory? Because most of the intellectual properties are owned by countries which belong to developed world. And now they want to sell their products in developing countries but want their IPRs to be protected at the same level as they are protected in developed countries. And now this is leading to creation of artificial scarcity of products, which can be okay in some cases but cannot be good in various fields. For example, in medical fields, in pharmaceuticals. Let's take an example of a medicine. Let's say if India has weak IPR laws and if a company somehow manages to develop the same medicine which is being sold in America and it starts the manufacturing. That is not possible right now, but at least it is going to save a lot of lives. But with imposition of strict TRIPS laws, only company A, which originally manufactured that medicine, is allowed to sell products in the developing countries as well. Then the next issue arises from dispute resolution mechanism of WTO. Dispute settlement system, or DSS, is a mechanism to resolve trade dispute between and among member states. The members of DSS are also appointed by consensus. And so if one of the member blocks the appointment, it shall become dysfunctional, and it has become dysfunctional since 2019 because of a lot of trouble being created by United States, which has led to very low number of judges to produce rulings. There are just not enough judges to produce rulings, and it has led to a huge backlog of cases pending in DSS. And finally, when the countries grow very powerful, they start resorting to unilateral tariffs. If you are reading newspaper, you must have read that in past 2 to 3 years, how China and USA have unilaterally imposed various kinds of tariffs on each other products without paying heed to the rules and procedures of WTO. Similarly, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, many countries including India have resorted to protectionism despite WTO in existence. So clearly you can understand that challenges in front of WTO are not small. There are mega challenges which the new Director General would have to face. So in this regard, in this discussion, we started by first understanding the context in which the parent body or the predecessor of WTO was formed, that is GATT. That context was extreme protectionism, to counter which a GATT was established, which then passed on the baton to WTO. Then we understood what advantages have been arrived, how it has worked in favor of increasing the global trade, but nonetheless it has its fair share of challenges and issues which needs to be resolved pretty soon. Let us now move on to the next discussion. The next article for discussion is editorial appearing on page number 6, a protocol of deference that is plainly injurious. Now, deference means respect, and according to the author, this new trend in Indian judiciary, in which judiciary seems to be paying a lot of respect to the executive, is ultimately injurious to the country. And the instance which the author has chosen to demonstrate this is the approval given by Supreme Court for the performance of Bhumi Pujan for new parliament building being constructed in New Delhi. Then in this discussion, author makes a comparison of court system in India with that of United States, and that is not quite relevant for UPSC civil services examination. But what is important is to understand a very important concept of judicial activism and judicial overreach. What are the instances or what are the examples of the case studies where the judiciary has been seen to practice activism or overreach? What are its advantages, and then what are the problems with the overreach and activism? So we all know that Constitution of India itself provides for judicial review. If you read Article 32 or if you read Article 226, the powers have been given to Supreme Court and High Court respectively to declare a statute ultra vires the Constitution and to nullify an executive action as unconstitutional. Apart from these two articles, there are other articles as well which empower the higher judiciary to do so. So these are the powers to judicially review the executive and legislative actions. These powers of judicial review are given not to make the judiciary superior, but to ensure a system of checks and balances between the legislature and executive on one hand and judiciary on the other. In short, court should interpret the law and not intervene in policy making. And that is where comes the judicial activism and judicial overreach. Now, judicial activism means that instead of judicial restraint, the Supreme Court and other lower courts become activists and compel or direct the parliament or the government to act. So generally, the powers given in the Constitution to the higher judiciary is to nullify an order, which according to them is unconstitutional. But in various cases, it has been observed that judiciary commands itself a policy-making, law-making, executive role. The judges use their powers to correct injustices and play an active role in shaping social policies on various issues such as civil rights, protection of individual rights, environmental protection, protection of weaker section, etc. Of course, it is true that judicial activism mainly occurs due to non-activity of other organs of the government. For example, take the case of police reforms. We know that this reform is long pending, and so in Prakash Singh case, Supreme Court directed the governments to take various steps. If various state governments had taken the police reforms due over time, then they would have obviated the need for any Supreme Court judgment in this regard. So you can say that the genesis of judicial overreach or activism is located in the inactivity of the parliament or the executive. But judicial overreach is one step higher than activism. It refers to an extreme form of judicial activism where often arbitrary, unreasonable and frequent interventions are made by judiciary into the domain of legislature and executive with the intention of disrupting the balance of power. This is a situation where the court encroaches upon the role of legislature by making laws. In some instances, the court also encroaches upon the role of executive by taking executive decisions. And so it can take four possible forms. Terms of articles of the Constitution can be changed by Supreme Court decision. Judiciary can introduce policies which are the domain of executive. Judiciary can lay down regulations which are in fact an area of the legislature. And then court decisions can impose a fiscal burden on the state in the form of expenditure incurred or revenue foregone, which is the domain of both executive and legislative. So you can see that higher judiciary can enter into all these domains for which the Constitution has not envisaged such a role. And to substantiate these arguments, we have few examples. Starting with introduction of the concept of due process of law. We know that in India, if you read Article 21, it says procedures established by law. But in Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India case, the Supreme Court introduced the concept of due process of law. Now, under the due process of law, procedure which is established by law must be just, fair and reasonable. So for example, for enactment of law, you need to follow certain procedure. You will have to get it passed from Lok Sabha, Raj Sabha, and then you need the presidential assent. Of course, not all bills pass through this procedure, but in most legislation you have to follow this procedure. And once this process is followed, any bill which confers to the provisions of the constitution is valid. But Supreme Court in Maneka Gandhi ruled that even if a law follows the procedure laid down in the constitution, then also it must be just, fair and reasonable. Further, the court held that the right to life as embodied in Article 21 is not merely confined to animal existence or survival, but it includes within its ambit the right to live and live with human dignity and all those aspects of life which go to make a man's life meaningful, complete and worth living. So you can see that through a single Supreme Court judgment, the meaning and implication of Article 21 was expanded. Similarly, in Shyam Narayan Choksi versus Union of India case, the Supreme Court made it mandatory for all the cinema halls to play national anthem before the start of a movie. Now this is clearly either legislative or executive domain. Ideally, what should have happened is that Government of India should have come with a law or an order mandating the cinema halls to play national anthem, and then this decision would have challenged in Supreme Court and then the decision would have come. But here, a proactive step was taken by Supreme Court. This direction of SC hence goes beyond the Prevention of Insults to Honor Act 1971. The Act provides that no film, drama or show of any sort can have the national anthem as a part of the show. So you can see that Supreme Court has in a kind of way amended a law passed by the Parliament of India. Then an instance of ban on liquor sale. On the basis of public interest litigation, the Supreme Court banned the sale of liquor at retail outlets, hotels and bars that are within 500 meters of any national or state highway. Of course, it is an administrative matter where the decision should rest with the executive. The court was not an appropriate authority for such kind of decision. Similarly, the cancellation of 2G licenses. The Supreme Court ordered to cancel 122 telecom licenses and spectrum allocated to 8 companies. The Supreme Court held that the process of allocation was flawed, and it further directed the government to allocate national resources through auctions only. Now this is an economic decision which has to be made by the parliament or the government. The economic decisions of a country are the sole domain of the legislative and executive bodies. And this is a clear case of judicial overreach wherein the Supreme Court took the decision without taking into account the adverse impact of its decisions. So these are the clear-cut examples, and these are just a few examples in past few years which clearly demonstrate judicial activism and in some cases might be overreach as well. And so in this regard, let us now discuss the advantages as well as issues arising out of judicial overreach. Of course, since there is a lot of inactivity on behalf of legislature and executive, judicial overreach sometimes addresses the inaction. It drastically enhances or improves the image of the judiciary in the minds of people, and it makes it look like a pro-people institution in contrary to executive and legislature. Then it helps in the protection of the spirit of the Constitution by giving a wider definition to various articles of the Constitution such as 14, 19, 21 and 32. Of course, since most of the decisions are targeted toward government scams, it promotes transparency and accountability in governance. Then in some cases, it has also meant to prevent arbitrary state action. And then it acts as a check and balance on the executive, as clearly seen in the judgment of 2G and coal scam. But there are problems also. First and foremost is that it destroys the spirit of the Constitution, as the democracy stands on the separation of powers between the organs, and it is clearly expected of legislature to keep itself limited to the lawmaking, executive on implementing those laws, and judiciary on judging the actions of executive and legislature. Now with the judicial overreach, what judiciary does is that it starts making laws and it tries to enforce those laws through executive. And so, of course, it destroys the spirit of the Constitution, which deals with the separation of power and which leads to conflict between legislature and judiciary. And the fundamental problem is that the people consisting of judiciary are not elected. whereas the people functioning as top executive and legislature are elected. And so it leads to the tyranny of unelected. If you don't like your government, you can change your government. But if you don't like the judges of higher judiciary, you cannot change them until you follow a very strict procedure, and you know that no judge of Supreme Court has been removed so far. And so it leads to the tyranny of unelected. Then it reduces the trust of the people in public institutions, which can be dangerous for democracy because it leads people to believe that only judiciary is that part of the state which is quite active in protection of their rights. And then finally, it overburdens the judiciary. When higher judiciary starts to engage itself in these executive and legislative like cases, the list of pendency goes on increasing. If judiciary would have not taken these cases, the available time and space could have been utilized for clearing the pending cases before the court. So in this regard, this is a very, very important aspect of mains GS paper 2, where judicial activism and overreach form an important part of paper. Let us now move on to the next news. The next article which we are going to take up appears on page number 6, Discouraging Numbers. This column has been written in context of the recent data release of National Family Health Survey 5 Phase 1. Now, an important thing to remember here is that the data or the survey which was conducted for NFHS 5 was completed well before the COVID-19 struck. And so, the impact of this pandemic will not be visible in this data. National Family Health Survey is a very, very important part of UPSC preparation. It gives you wide-ranging data from nutritional status, fertility rate, mortality rate, immunization rate, and various other parameters indicating the health status of our country. From the perspective of prelims examination, various aspects are important with respect to the agency which conducts this particular survey, or various other indicators can be asked. While as far as mains examination is concerned, various data given in National Family Health Survey report can be used to substantiate your answers, whether it is GS 1, 2, 3, 4 or even in essay. Also, these data can be important for you if your optional belongs to humanities subject. So let us now first understand few of the basics about National Family Health Survey. Now, if you want to understand why these surveys are conducted, that is because the government wants to provide reliable and comparable data on health, family welfare, and other emerging issues dealing with the health sector. Now, you can clearly see that this is NFHS 5, and so which means that 4 surveys have already been conducted. Most recent being NFHS 4, which was conducted in 2015 and 16. It is important to note here that all the rounds of NFHS have been conducted by this particular organization, International Institute for Population Sciences, situated in Mumbai. Now, if you want to understand the extent of the survey, you can see that around 6.1 lakh households have been surveyed to provide disaggregated data up to district levels. Once the survey is complete, it shall become available for full comparison with NFHS 4, and that is when we will know that various parameters dealing with health sector are improving or declining. Now, overall, the fact sheet which has been released for phase 1 includes information on 131 key indicators. Now, don't worry, we are not going to discuss all 131 key indicators, but rather we are going to discuss the ones which are very important. An important aspect is that various parameters on population, health and family welfare, nutrition are available, and the emphasis will be to keep the track of India's progress as far as sustainable development goals are concerned. Now, when many NFHs have been conducted earlier, question arises that how is the 5th different from the 4th? Majority of parameters of NFHS 4 and NFHS 5 are quite similar. Now, if we talk about the parameters, there is an expansion of domains of child immunization. Then in NFHS 5, the data has been collected on micronutrients availability to children, on menstrual hygiene, frequency of alcohol and tobacco use. There are certain additional components dealing with non-communicable diseases. So in these respects, NFHS 5 is different from NFHS 4. And now let us discuss key results from NFHS 5 Phase 1 fact sheet. And let us start by first discussing the total fertility rates. Now, the concept of total fertility rate has been discussed in our DNS many times. Let us know in the comment section what you understand by total fertility rate. Now, total fertility rate or TFR has declined since NFHS 4 in almost all the phase 1 states and UTs. We know that replacement level of fertility is 2.1. And it is heartening to note that this particular level has been achieved in 19 out of 22 states and UTs, and only 3 states, Manipur, Meghalaya and Bihar, have TFR above replacement level right now. Then an important part of our family planning program is to enhance the usage of contraceptive. And for that, government measures contraceptive prevalence rate. And this has also substantially increased in most states and UTs. Not just that, people are increasingly resorting to modern methods of contraception in most of the states. If we talk about immunization, then full immunization drive among children aged 12 to 23 months has recorded substantial improvement across states and UTs. In most of the states, more than 2/3 of the children are fully immunized. Then institutional deliveries are also very important. Institutional delivery or a birth that is taking place at any medical facility staffed by skilled and qualified professionals. And this number has also substantially increased, with over 4/5 of the women delivering in institutions in 19 states and UTs. Out of those 22 states, in 14 of the states, the proportion of institutional delivery is as high as 90%, which means that of all the 100 births which are taking place, 90 births are taking place in institutions like hospitals, nursing homes or dispensaries. So the 4 indicators which we have discussed so far are a good news. But there is a parameter on which the news is not great, and that is child nutrition indicators. Because while the situation has improved in many states and UTs, there has been a minor deterioration in others. Whereas if you compare the data with this one, there is an improvement in all the states, although the improvement might not be good. For example, in case of total fertility rate, 2.1 has been achieved by most states. But for example, Bihar has not achieved 2.1, but it is also showing improvement. But in case of child nutrition indicators, a downfall observed in many states. There is a drastic change in respect of stunting and wasting, and startling fact is that such kind of drastic change in stunting and wasting is quite unlikely in a short period of time, because we know that NFHS 4 was conducted in 2015 and 16, and this was conducted in a period of 2019 and 20. So within a period of 3 to 4 years, this downfall is quite unexpected. And similarly, anemia, which results from lack of red blood cells, or you can say dysfunctional red blood cells in the body, still continues to be a cause of concern. More than half of the children and women are anemic in 13 out of 22 states. It has also been observed that anemia among pregnant women has increased in half of the states and UTs as compared to NFHS 4, in spite of substantial increase in the consumption of IFA tablets by pregnant women for 180 days or more. Now, the percentage of households with improved sanitation facility and clean fuel for cooking has increased in almost all the 22 states. Now, this can be clearly understood as an indicator of or an impact of the government and policies being run from the central government. We know that Government of India has made efforts to provide toilet facilities to maximum households through Swachh Bharat mission and improved household environment through Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana in the country. And so, the improvement in all the states and UTs in sanitation facility and access to clean fuel is a direct indicator or a success of government policies. Now let's just take this example, and there is a question in GS2 or GS3 asking you to analyze the efficacy of either Swachh Bharat or Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, and you can quote this particular data from National Family and Health Survey to demonstrate the effectivity of these schemes on the ground level. So from the perspective of prelims examination, the basics about NFHS is very important, whereas from the perspective of mains examination, few sets of data should be kept in mind. Let us now move on to the next news. Privacy, a fundamental right the state must protect, appears on page number 6. Now this article is in reference to an older article dated 1st of December 2020 which discussed whether address of RTI applicant should be disclosed considering address to be a personal detail and protected as a part of private information as per right to privacy judgment, or what is famously known as KS Puttaswamy judgment, which clearly laid down right to privacy as a fundamental right. Now the matters raised in this particular case have already been discussed on 1st of December, and so we have utilized the opportunity to visit KS Puttaswamy judgment, a landmark judgment of Supreme Court which holds that right to privacy is protected as fundamental constitutional right under Articles 14, 19 and 21 of the Constitution of India. Now if you go to the Constitution's PDF available on Ministry of Law and Justice, and if you try to find, you will not find right to privacy, and so has been done through the interpretation of the Supreme Court in this particular case. Now Justice Puttaswamy judgment has two important components. First is the aspect of freedom and liberty, and the second is the aspect of restriction. So aspect of restriction is about when the right to privacy has been given the status of fundamental rights, how to put curbs on privacy if state has to and there are conditions for that. And similarly, aspects of freedom and liberty, which means that right to privacy is an integral part of right to life and personal liberty as guaranteed under Article 21 of Indian Constitution. According to the bench, privacy is the constitutional core of human dignity, and privacy has both normative as well as descriptive functions. Of course, this goes beyond the syllabus of UPSC Civil Services examination, but it is important to keep in mind these two things. Now, what does privacy according to the Supreme Court includes? Privacy includes at its core the preservation of personal intimacies, the sanctity of family life, marriage, procreation, the home, and sexual orientation. So now if you recall, the section 377 of IPC makes sexual activities against the order of the nature illegal. And as soon as the Puttaswamy judgment came, and it included the procreation, home, and sexual orientation under the right to privacy, the Supreme Court ruled that the application of 377 to consensual homosexual act is unjustified, and so that is a result of Puttaswamy judgment which made right to privacy a fundamental right guaranteed under Article 21, and its inference was procreation and sexual orientation became the part of right to privacy. Then, according to Supreme Court, privacy also means right to be left alone, and privacy protects heterogeneity and recognizes the plurality and diversity of culture. Supreme Court in the same judgment also laid down the restrictions as well. And right to privacy is not an absolute right like all other fundamental rights, and so it is also subjected to the kind of reasonable restrictions other fundamental rights are subjected to. And so, a law which encroaches upon privacy will have to withstand the touchstone of permissible restrictions on fundamental rights. The law must be valid with reference to encroachment on life and personal liberty under Article 21. If Parliament wants to put curb on right to privacy, an invasion of life or personal liberty must meet the threefold requirement. First, legality. If you want to curb right to privacy, you will have to make a law. You cannot do it with an executive order. Then, there should be sufficient need defined in terms of a legitimate state aim. You cannot just put curb on anyone's privacy, but for concern or a major concern of a state, and then there should be a test of proportionality which ensures a rational nexus between the object and means adopted to achieve them. At the same time, it is important for us to understand both positive as well as negative aspects of privacy. Positive aspect of privacy imposes an obligation on the state to take all necessary measures to protect the privacy of an individual, whereas on the contrary, negative aspect of privacy restrains the state from committing an intrusion upon the life and personal liberty of a citizen. Now, concepts like these are very important not just from mains perspective but also from prelims point of view. The question in prelims examination dealing with the basic concepts of political theory have already been asked many times, as you can see on your screen. And so it is important to keep in touch with the concepts which are evolving through time. Let us now move on to the next news. This last news which we are going to discuss appears on page number 6, Excellence in Diversity. This column takes up an important issue of reservation in India. Since the expansion of IIT system with the introduction of OBC reservation in educational institutions, these institutes have not been able to fill vacancies for faculty members, which also have to meet quota requirements mandated by Central Education Institutes Reservation in Teachers Cadre Act 2019. Now, according to the CEI Act of 2019, the IITs must fulfill the important goal of affirmative action while making appointments, and so the reservations have been made, and so they have to follow the mandatory provision regarding reservation while recruitment. And this has envisaged reservations not just for SCs and STs but also members of OBC and people belonging to economically weaker sections or EWS category. So while this particular act is an enabling legislation, there is a severe mismatch in the demand and availability of technology graduates. For example, IIT Delhi had a staggering deficit of 30% in its teachers rank, and there are 23 such institutions in India now. And so in this regard, a committee was appointed by the government for suggesting measures for effective implementation of reservation in students' admission and faculty recruitment in IITs. And its recommendations have come based on which this column appears. So the recommendations of the committee are that IITs should be added to the list of institutions of excellence mentioned in the schedule to this particular act. And why it should be added? According to the committee, it should be added because it will exempt the IITs from providing reservation, because they believe that they are institutions of excellence, and since they are not able to find the kind of quality they are looking for in a faculty, they should be categorized as institution of excellence and which provides exemption from reservation. And according to the committee, this matter of reservation in these institutions may be vested with their respective board of governors to deal with as per the board resolutions and their bylaws, and should not be guided by the provisions of this legislation. So the column posits that merely providing reservation is not going to correct the historical problem of caste-based privileges as well as discrimination. Besides reservation, there is a need for massive investment in education system at all levels, which can raise the capabilities of students, especially belonging to the vulnerable section of our society. Because if we are going to do massive investment in education system, it will actually lead to the opportunity and will create conducive environment for growth, which will then ensure justice for those who were earlier deprived. And so the committee in this regard recommends a government-sponsored preparatory program at IITs which can help candidates eligible for reservation to get acquainted with high-quality academic work and optionally prepare for a PhD if they aspire to be teachers. And so, in that way, the current deficit in the faculty coming from SC, ST, OBC and EWS sections can be minimized. And this is quite important because such graduates will just not fill the vacancies in IITs, but will also aid the large number of other technical educational institutions that aspire to research excellence. Apart from that, it will strengthen the diversity of our higher education institutions and lay the foundation for kind of scholarship that institutions of excellence need. So the question of the day for yesterday was, with reference to Financial Stability and Development Council, consider the following statements. One was, it is headed by RBI Governor. And B was, it has been set up to ensure coordination between various financial sector regulators. And the right answer is B, as the FSDC is headed by the Finance Minister and not the RBI Governor. And the question of the day for today is, which of the following options can be considered as instances of judicial activism? First is deliberation of the Supreme Court on the constitutionality of a law. Statement 2, ordering the Parliament to make a law on a matter relating to public importance. Statement 3, giving directions to the CBI to initiate investigations against politicians in corruption cases. You have to select the correct answer using the code given below: A, 1 only, B, 1 and 2 only, C, 2 and 3 only, D, 1, 2 and 3.